What is flavor? It's a word that I'm sure you've heard bounce around your circles through that one friend. Have heard your favorite YouTuber bring it up in some discussion or list, or heard it mentioned in one of Mark Rosewater's articles. But it's one of those aspects of the game that has remained abstract, a thought, a whisper. And whether you are directly aware of its presence or not, it is what has silently endured this game to millions, including you. That is why it's important we break down these invisible barriers and answer the three main questions surrounding it. What exactly is flavor? What is its history in the game? And of course, why is it so important? Before we get into that though, I would just like to extend a special thank you to my newest patron, Mr. Space Wizard. With that, let us begin with the most important question, and that is... Doug Beyer, creative designer for Magic the Gathering, defined flavor as simulation in a 2010 article he wrote, aptly named What is Flavor? And I'm inclined to agree with the use of this definition. But what does this really mean in the context of Magic? Well, in short, it's the act of transposing a concept, a character, story beat, or environment onto a card. Often when we think of a simulation, we think of something digital, right? But in the case of Magic, it's flipped around. Instead, the card is acting as a tangible proxy for an intangible idea. It's worlds that only exist in stories and imagination. These abstractions are then given a place in the real world, as cards that we can hold and collect. As such, they become something more than an idea. They become reality. But to successfully accomplish this simulation, the card must work within the confines of its own design. It's the sum of all of its parts working together to express a single concept in order to convince us of the intended idea. To accomplish this simulation, the card must leverage the name, the art, the type, the effect, the stats, the color pie, and of course the flavor text. If done right, the simulation is seamless, and we intuit the intent with ease, rather than being stuck in the uncanny valley we call the flavor fail. I personally find the best way to learn a given concept is by looking to an example. So let me show you this card bring to trial. It's simple, and yet it's full of flavor. A perfect slice of Ravnica and a great expression of one of its guilds. When we look at the card as a whole, with each of its parts in mind, you begin to understand why Doug Beyer used the term simulation. Of course, the Azorius are not real, nor are giants being taken to court, but it's a believable transportation to another time and place, because the card has simulated it flawlessly through its name, choice of color, art, type, rules text, and flavor text. If any one of these parts were off in some way, the simulation would not have the same effect, and in fact, we would reject it at first sight. As we noticed with our example, the name of the card is often the greatest tool for setting expectations. The name's job is there to inform us of what the rest of the card, in terms of flavor, aims to accomplish. Now, I'm certain that it's one of the last things that is set in stone when designing a card, but it does a lot of the heavy lifting when us players are viewing any given card. To the right of the name is the color cost, and is one of the inherent advantages that Magic the Gathering has when it comes to expressing flavors, and that is its use of the color pie. This act of cost categorization actually adds its own layer of flavor because of the methodology and philosophy baked into each color, and combinations of those colors. With the color pie alone, we can make assumptions of any given character or faction that appear on a given card. We know that a red character can be brash and emotional. We understand that a black-white faction is one of moral ambiguity. This is why the assignment of colors goes beyond design. Just like with the rules text, the color pie is a deliberate choice, not just in terms of mechanical design, but in flavor as well. This is why the color pie simulates philosophy while also abiding to player expectations. As such, it is a core to flavor. Below the name and the mana cost is the art, which is a snapshot in time and space, and aids in bringing the total concept to life at a glance. The art then facilitates or relieves the burden on our imagination. But in truth, the art does not have to be present. It simply adds to the tone of the card. We know this because in Magic, especially in modern times, the art is interchangeable, while the other pieces are not. The job of art on a card is to add to the flavor, but if the flavor of the rest of the card is strong enough, our imagination should be able to fill in this blank. Below that is the card type. In the case of our initial example, it was a sorcery, which is best thought of as an action rather than a place or character, which would otherwise be a land or creature respectively. The type is useful when it comes to flavor because it places the character, event, or place into a known box, which we can use to compare it against others who also fit in that box. Think of how when you see an elf type, it evokes expectations all in a single word, which can be bolstered further with the class as well. Below the type is the cornerstone of any card, and that is the rules text. Now that our expectations have been set from the top half of the card, we must assume that the rules text will now reinforce those established expectations. Otherwise, the simulation falls apart. It may seem that the logical aspect of a given card, that is the rules text, would be at odds with the artistic flavor, but this notion could not be further from the truth. Flavor does not trump function, nor does function to flavor. They must work together, and when they do, we get the strongest examples of flavor. This balance is precarious though, don't get me wrong, because if flavor takes over, you get these hyper-specific cards with no use outside of pure fluff. And if function trumps flavor, you are left with mechanical blandness. The two may often find themselves at odds with each other during the design phase, but this struggle is an important one. Mark Rosewater said as much in his 2003 article Bursting with Flavor. Game mechanics like names, mana costs, card types, flavor text, power, and toughness are a tool used to create a magic card. This tool can be used for flavor and for function. The best game mechanics, in fact, have both flavor and function. The final piece is the flavor text, an optional component of flavor that is welcome but not needed. Kind of odd, I know, considering it's called flavor text, but in truth, it's best to think of flavor text as nothing more than a dressing, something that is not necessary to the equation, but a welcome addition nonetheless. What I mean here is that flavor text should add additional context, but should not carry the burden of flavor. With each of these pieces in place, the name, color cost, art, type, rules text, and flavor text, the simulation can be achieved effectively. Flavor is not one of these things on its own, but rather the interactions each part have with the whole that achieves something greater. Think of each part of the card like a puzzle piece. We may be able to guess the final image from its individual parts, but it isn't until we place the final piece that we may witness the complete image. Flavor has been a part of Magic's identity since the beginning. Richard Garfield knew what he wanted the game to feel and look like. He conceptualized a high fantasy game, and as such, he filled it with all of the things we have come to expect in those kinds of worlds. It wasn't that he knew he needed a card with 1/1 stats and regenerate. No, he needed a skeleton. So he asked, what does that look like? It wasn't that he thought about how much the game needed a 2/2 that gave other cards Mountain Walk. No, he wanted to give the game a Goblin King, and then asked himself how to accomplish this through flavor. With this intention in mind, he set out to fulfill those expectations we had, rudimentary as they were. As we know now, flavor would continue to evolve alongside the game, and our rising expectations of it. Not long after Arabian Nights and the Dark, the team at Magic began to see cracks in simply building flavor off of old tropes. and knew it needed to begin crafting worlds and stories all their own, as a way to get the player base further invested in the game, and to give the designers more to work with. Brady Dommermuth talked about this in his 2003 article, The Story of the Story. Wizards found out the hard way though that representing a fantasy world on cards only takes you so far, maybe 1,000 cards. When R&D started coming up with more abstract mechanics that didn't really have a connection to a fantasy world, such as buyback, echo, or cycling, we had to try some new approaches. That something new was the introduction of books, which aimed to create a cohesive story across the game, and thus the cards had something to latch onto when it came to flavor. Now, each card wasn't simply pulling from established fantasy tropes, but could now hint at or showcase aspects of the story and characters. But there was a problem with this too, because now the designers relied heavily on the writing of the books. From this standpoint, they had to try a new approach, something that would take an environment-centric look at flavor. In this style, the worlds would be built by creatives and the story would be conceptualized all parallel to design. The goal of the cards and flavor now would be to express the world, to bring its every inch to life. Important story beats would still appear on cards, sure, but their goal was to describe the world, its monsters, its civilization, its magic, and so on. In short, the big idea drives the world, and the world and the big idea work together to drive the cards first, then the novels and everything else. Even though Brady is speaking to us from 20 years ago in this article, we can see how this approach has continued on into the modern day, a time where we no longer spend an entire year on a plane, and as such, it has become more important than ever to utilize flavor to establish the ties between set and setting. But why do all of this? What really is the purpose or importance of flavor? I have a question for you. Which of these two cards appeals to you more? I mean, they both function in the same way, yet I have a feeling all but a few contrarians will choose the one on the right. Why is that? Sure, one is more flashy, it has vivid art, but really does that affect your gameplay in the slightest? Simply put, no it doesn't. And yet, these small details and their work in conjunction are an important part of our enjoyment of Magic the Gathering. Not because they are game pieces with text upon them that facilitate this game, gripping as it is, but because of our human nature. We are naturally drawn to that which holds familiarity and emotion. As such, we create attachments to these characters, worlds, creatures, and events. We are not just playing a game, but feeding into a broader world that is built upon the cards and facilitated by our imagination. This is the taste of Magic that we've become such deep fans of, whether we have noticed its influence or not. The role of flavor isn't so much to wow us, to form some spicy dish that we can't forget. Rather, it's there to spoon feed us a setting, events, characters, and items in a convincing way. In most cases, it isn't some complete dish, but rather part of a whole experience. And as such, while each piece must stand on its own, we aren't really getting the whole picture with one card. In fact, most cases, the flavor of cards goes nearly unnoticed, and that's a good thing. Video games have a similar need when it comes to crafting their environments. Sure, you might not notice every small detail that someone painstakingly put together, but as a total package, it brings a world to life. Think of a set in a similar way. Each card within it must stand on its own, but the beauty of flavor is bringing the entire setting to life, whether we notice the effort taken on each card or not. On the flip side, if these small details or acts of flavor are not present, it goes from being invisible to a sore spot in the game. I'm sure you've played one of those cheaply made video games with little or no love put into them. You proceed into one of its villages and it just feels off. Perhaps the NPCs are standing perfectly still. The homes are barren and there isn't any music. This lack of immersion pulls us out of our imagination and into a literal space. The same thing happens in Magic. Think of a pack of cards like that village. If the first card you pull is bland or does not meet your expectations of the setting, then something just feels off. Our immersion is broken. Flavor has a big job, an invisible job in most cases, to bring the game to life and to immerse us in new worlds. It is the context behind our actions, and if there is no context, we are removed from the intent. This is because flavor creates a consistency of feel, as it's the glue that holds both set and setting together. This connection aids in creating cohesive card design that lends itself to a given plane. I've been saying it a few times in this video, but to put it plainly, flavor is also a fulfillment of expectations, which is the meeting of our assumptions based on established knowledge. If we know that a fantasy game is going to have elves, dragons, goblins, and the like, then we expect them to act in the ways we are familiar with. A dragon should fly and be imposing. Goblins should be small yet come in hordes, and elves should have a focus on nature. This meeting of expectations is something that can be a sore spot when a card does not meet them. Why can't Whippoorwill fly? Why does Blood-Soaked Champion have 2 shields but can't block? They both still function just fine, yet our expectations are not met, or alternatively, they're not subverted in a meaningful way. This idea takes us back to the beginning of the game, with Richard Garfield's intent to mimic the tropes of the fantasy stories he loved and of the tabletop games he played. But it goes further than that. Think of how this is used to build out our assumptions of top-down designed planes, places like Innistrad and its horror themes, or Eldraine and fairy tales. Flavor can rely on our expectations and knowledge, then twist it in a way that is unique to a given plane in order to make it its own. Because yes, expectations of flavor can be used in a way that dashes expectations, but it must be done in a consistent way. Like a movie that sets the rules of its world but must obey them lest the believability of that world fall apart. While flavor is of the utmost importance to the designers of this game, us players interact with flavor all the time. Many of us do not build our decks around some optimal game plan, but rather a card or concept that has caught our attention. Perhaps we want to feel like a necromancer wearing our opponent down with endless hordes summoned from the grave. Or we adore a certain character and want to make them our commander. Flavor is there not just as a mechanism to build up the world that Magic has created, but for us to find our own story to tell. It's what endears us to specific decks and adds a new layer onto the game itself. Without flavor, the game would be directionless. It would be a mashup of ideas and effects. It is the invisible hand guiding us through worlds, introducing us to characters and expressing certain events. It is abstract and yet tangible, a simulation of a world out of reach. Without flavor, the game would be gray. It would be one replaced by code and math, as function would be the only goal. But what is function without art? Truly not a world I would wish to be a part of. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Now I'm curious, what card is your favorite for purely flavorful reasons? And if you want to see flavor in action, check out this video here where I discuss life gain and its variability in flavor based on the colors that interact with it. With that, friends, I will catch you in the multiverse. Bye.